We are so grateful and so honored to have Hana Kassem here today present her work. In terms of introduction, I'll start with how we at Cooper met Hana. As many of you know, she's leading an advanced studio here at the Cooper Union dealing with forced migration and displaced populations here in New York City. And Hana is also a principal at KPF Associates, leading the design projects of leading design projects both globally and in the US. Her work examines how we affect our environment and how, in turn, our built environment impacts us. Her architectural approach centers human-centric and sustainable design, aiming to elevate well-being and meet societal needs to foster enriching and equitable spaces. Her work spans academic, research, cultural, hospitality, residential, and mixed-use projects in Brazil, the US, France, the Philippines, and China. And she's earned awards and recognition in projects like the Red Hook House's Resiliency and Recovery for NYCHA and the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center in New York City. Hana also has an incredibly important presence in New York architectural institutions. She serves as VP for Design Excellence at the AIA New York Board of Trustees and is the founding chair of AIA New York's annual Leaning Out Women in Architecture panel. She also serves on the Van Alen Institute's Executive Board of Trustees, where she spearheaded the initiation of the Neighborhoods Now project, mobilizing architects during the COVID-19 pandemic to aid communities. Kassem, as a faculty member, as an educator, has taught also at Yale School of Architecture and Parsons, emphasizing experiential engagement with the environment, particularly in marginalized communities. She also co-edited the book Architect d.b.a. on redefining the roles of the architect today, reflecting her passion for reshaping the architectural landscape. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much, Hana, for your lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this introduction. So as a preface, I would just say I'm very happy to be here and speaking in this intimate setting. I think it'll be...
Should I turn the lights? Should I turn the lights?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So it's rare to be able to do that. I'm going to be giving a kind of a general overview of the range of our work at KPF, but I'm going to be focusing in this particular talk on my projects and my approach within that larger umbrella, as this is really meant to be a talk where the faculty and students at Cooper get to know who I am and what my approach to architecture and design might be, pedagogical approach included. So with that in mind, we don't have chalk and work to do, so I'm doing my Louis Kahn version of it here. But as Nora introduced briefly, the way I think about space making and architecture is kind of a circular notion that has to do with our impact on environments, the impact on environments on us, and really at the center of it is this notion of resonance, when the two balance each other and work in tandem. Something that is really essential to my investigation and really started probably when I was your age in school is the question of what is universal and what is culturally specific. And that, you might say, underlies a lot of the thinking and a lot of the process of developing solutions or approaches, architectural approaches. And might say that our impact on environments could be easily associated with what we might call universal and impact of environments on us may be associated with what is more culturally specific, or you could question that and wonder whether it's actually the exact opposite. And I go back and forth in this question, and hopefully we can have a conversation about it afterwards. So I would start with this quote from Bachelard that says after the original reverberation, we're able to experience resonances, sentimental repercussions, reminders of our past, but the image has touched the depth before it stirs the surface. And here, when we think about the image touching the depth before it stirs the surface, the reason I picked this quote to start with is, in some ways, you could say that the image touching the depth has something to do more with impacts of environments on us in a universal manner. We might all respond to certain spaces in a particular way that is more the same than different. And at the surface of it is more the cognitive response or the aspects that are associated with a narrative that are more culturally specific. This is one way of thinking about it. I'll give you some examples. So here, this color red, for example, does it, in its very abstract way, does it affect us more the same than in a different manner? Is this a universal? And when you start to think about the narrative associations with it, if you bring this color in a setting in China, for example, you could think about the deluge of associations with that color that have to do with the history and politics of the country, versus in Spain, where that color has a different kind of narrative associated with it. Maybe it has to do with, things that we see, people fighting and other things, or passion in general, right? Like there are many interpretations to that color, but it's an interpretation. It's kind of more of a cognitive or a narratively built interpretation of it, rather than the immediate effect of that color on us. Materials that we choose. We are in love as architects. We love raw concrete. It's fantastic. It's beautiful. Do we think it's universally appreciated? Is there something about that material that affects one when they walk into a room that is more universal than culturally specific? I know, when I have proposed raw concrete in some context for certain environments and communities, it's not really thought of in the same way that we think about it. It's thought of as being a poor material. It's thought of as being an unfinished material. So maybe somebody did not put an effort into it, right? It doesn't have an effort into designing that space. And so these are all questions that come into mind. And I'm going to bring in here, before I go into projects of our own at KPF, just this discovery that we made maybe 2 years ago on a trip to Japan. And this is the work of Hiroshi Fujimoto. It's the Nora Observatory, and it's a absolutely gorgeous place on a cliff facing the water. And it's a real estate that it's a whole series of interventions within the landscape, some gallery spaces, some artifacts that seem to really toggle between this very abstract, elemental, all universal, and the very culturally specific elements that he has positioned there in the landscape and also in some of the semi-enclosed spaces. And you can see here the kind of juxtaposition of the very elemental, highly experiential moments in this place, juxtaposed with artifacts that have a history to them, that are very culturally embedded. Either they come from a temple. There were some bases of columns from Hiroshima that were transplanted here and arranged in a particular way, and they still resonated. I mean, this particular image here, where you have the projection of the space over the water, and the marking of the threshold but then the positioning of an element from a temple juxtaposed in that abstraction, I found it really powerful and very fascinating. Of course, the work that we're doing has nothing to do that we're doing at KPF are a lot more day-to-day type of spaces, I'm going to call them. It's kind of more like the experiential, but in an everyday kind of way, right? They're academic buildings, they're commercial buildings. They're not spaces that you think of as spaces that are spiritual spaces that would elevate you in such a way. But we're looking for that. I'm looking for that in our work so that this resonance, the idea of resonance, can come through even in your day to day as you go to school, as you go to work, as you walk into your home, that you feel a sense of belonging in there. And I'm going to bring in one more thought here, which is there is a growing field that is at the intersection of neuroscience and architecture, which I'm very involved in, and there is a study which I will pull up here that is led by a number of researchers, including Anjan Chatterjee, who have identified three notions that per this research seem to coincide with a feeling of attraction to a space or an object, an understanding of it as, or a qualifying of it as beautiful. I'm going to project the word resonant into it. And those three elements were coherence, fascination, and hominess. So coherence is the rationality, our ability to understand a work of art or a spatial configuration, architecture, to understand it rationally in our mind, right? We see clarity in it. Fascination has to do with the sense of discovery, something that pulls you through, that asks you, that kind of compels you to discover more. It has to do with delight. It has to do with surprise, the unexpected. And hominess is really the one that is the trickiest. Hominess, I'm going to say, this is not my term, it's their term. I'm going to interpret it as belonging. So, but hominess is really the trickiest because this is where we're talking about belonging. This is where we're talking about elements that might be qualified, I think, as universal or cultural. You could say that we all feel there are certain elements in our environment that we all respond to. As infants, we kind of grew up in more or less similar environments that are homey. We associate hominess with that feeling. But then very quickly, it can become something that is very culturally embedded and it can flip on you. And so this is really the thing that has been the most puzzling in my work. And that I hope to be able to explore. And why it makes sense that I would be able to do this at KPF is because we are, in fact, working everywhere in the world. We have 9 offices across 3 continents, over 600 projects, so a lot of square footage, a lot of responsibility towards both the environment and the people that inhabit those spaces in terms of their well-being. So that idea of circular notion really comes into play because of the amount of space that we have our hand in as designers and as architects. 35 countries, many languages spoken at KPF. So it's really about the translation and the juxtaposition of also a huge number of typologies that we work in, from the most commercial to the most, to health and science, academic, master plans. So it's quite a wide range. So it becomes a really amazing platform to be able to tackle this question of universality and culturally specific aspects of architecture and design, and see how it plays out. So I will show a couple of projects. some more in depth than others. And hopefully you'll see some of these questions in the thread of the conversation coming through. So this is a project in Guangzhou, China for Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. This is how the site was prior to our master plan and our work there. And mostly agricultural. There's a canal that traverses through it. There was quite a rational master plan that was developed by my partners at KPF. I wasn't super involved in the master plan itself, but then in buildings within that. So the master plan had to do with, say, the machine in the park, a very rational organization of these 8 lab buildings that sit within a campus, create a whole campus. There's a residential component, series of buildings on this side, and on the opposite side, there's the canal going through it, and there are a few key buildings that anchor the beginning and the end of this campus. This campus was designed, master planned, and built over 3.5, 4 years, which is absolutely insane. It happened through COVID. And I will talk only about 2 of those buildings that I had a hand in. And basically, as a counterpart to the more rational planning of the lab buildings, there was this idea of a green belt that had to do with connecting to nature and almost like an antidote to being in the lab and focusing in a rational, very intense way for hours and hours. So there are a couple of buildings that are the activity center here that are developed as a landscape building of sorts, and the athletic complex, and they connect through, and I'll talk about those mostly, as well as this administration building, which is the gateway central piece that you arrive through. So starting with that, so Hong Kong University of Science and Technology has a campus already in Hong Kong, which is their Clear Water Bay campus that you see an image of here. And this image shows you this exedra type of structure that was there. I think my guess is probably around somewhere in the 80s. And at the center of it has this firebird sculpture, which is very symbolic to them. And their new campus in mainland China was supposed to be very much connecting back to the original campus, keeping the symbolicism, this arrival plaza, making sure that the identity of the campus was translated, but translated, not replicated. So in other words, what they were trying to do in China is create a campus that felt more open, more dynamic, that was more porous, and that translated into their pedagogy of teaching and the way that they structured the curriculum as well. And so our way of thinking about it was exactly that, was yes, we'll keep this semicircular notion, but we'll create a very dynamic form that is asymmetric, and that through this giant gateway creates a lot of porosity inside and out, as well as how it relates back to the rest of the campus. And there you see the integration of nature through it, that canal that comes through, and the notion of both coherence, but also now the campus itself being a series of almost like meandering spaces of, you might say, fascination, that where you find yourself through this constructed nature, constructed series of buildings, and that avoid any kind of axial, completely open vistas through. So it kind of toggles in between this coherence and fascination, I think, in a way that unfolds as you go through the campus. A series of green spaces and terraces that cut through. And then one element that that is part of a narrative that we really latched onto was the bamboo shoot, because the idea of the bamboo, the symbolicism behind bamboo is that it speaks of growth and progress as a narrative and as a symbol in most of the region. Various countries of the region relate to the bamboo shoot in that way. And this was meant to be a place that drew from countries all around, including various parts of China, in terms of its student body. So we felt that this was perhaps something that allowed, very much in a way of, if you think about classical music versus music with lyrics embedded in it, sometimes the lyrics allow somebody that may not be trained musically to enter a piece. You know, the lyrics might be something that they start paying attention to, has meaning to them, and then they begin to actually listen to the piece. And so this was our way of sort of bringing in the student body and creating a hook or a moment where they can attach to a narrative and start to identify with the building and the series of buildings there. So long story short, just because it's a motif that appears again in other buildings in a different way, here's how we tried to look at the texture and the sort of fluting of the bamboo shoot and create this patterning in the facade. And then in terms of what it does from a sustainability point of view and how we're able to tap into what is called the living lab here for the whole campus, where all the buildings are connected to a circuit where they can be measured, their performance can be measured in real time. And there is campus brain, which is a space that where all that information is collected. So whether it's renewables or hybrid ventilation, it's something that we are able to bring in here, or water management. So this is that whole living lab concept. And then the second building is the Student Center, which is this very landscape-oriented building that sits right behind it. And again, here it's a landscape building, and the facade of this building is one that borrows from this texture of the bamboo shoot and creates something that is quite unique on the campus, perhaps a little bit more less formal than some of the other buildings. And in terms of its planning, pulls people through, creates this interior street that is very much about this notion of fascination and discovery throughout. And it connects the residential areas with the campus research areas on the opposite end, in this kind of meandering path on two levels. This is just as the building is starting to get inhabited, so we don't have many images of it fully furnished. And then again here, in terms of its renewables and hybrid ventilation, it's something that we really worked very hard to be able to execute, and hopefully it'll bear fruit. Jumping to very, very different contexts. So the idea of belonging in HKUST in the project that I showed earlier is more about belonging, but in a way, in a time-constrained manner, right? So as students come through, they're there for 4 or 5 years. The place and the memories of the place that hold them together are very important to them, right? Everybody went to college, you're still here. You're going to remember Cooper decades from now, and you're going to remember certain spaces and certain moments within it as being very like landmarks in your development. And so that's very important for a campus. I think understanding that the student body is passing through and that they have this moment in their life where they come together and their memories and their relationships are intrinsically embedded with place where they occurred. In a very different context, but again, 29 buildings, somehow funnily the same number of buildings, but in a very different context. Red Hook houses this NYCHA project, which is in Brooklyn, in Red Hook, and was a FEMA-funded project that came to us post Sandy, and is a project to restore, protect, and enhance this whole development that was completely devastated. And so what I'm going to do is share with you this couple of minute video that tells a good story about it. Hopefully the audio is working.
There's 1 point, 2 points, 3 points, 4 points. The cause of when the order came in, the down, just rolling down the stairs. I even said, my sister on the phone, I said, this is where it's over. Everything's on the wall. Like actors in there. Something seemed like it's going to stop. Then these people write some trouble. Initial 8 days. So, 9 and 10 days got cold. It was in October. That's interesting. Go step by step. Next way. Put them on the 10th floor, 70 years old. I think it was Superstorm Sandy, sir. Juries, neighbors, the first responders, federal government after a long time and passed it. To public housing. We needed to make sure that everything was at the table. And that designer joined us. So I think the next chapter. We actually requested when we started the project that we got to speak the record. That's a direct relationship between the architect and people living. Bringing art and their trust and forming a solution that's really going to be the best. First, speaking to these were barriers. We have come to them what we thought concepts and ideas that would be welcome. However, their main complaints had almost nothing to do with what we had as the main issues to solve. One of the things that we discovered during the engagement process was, yes, we have been seeing issues that the site based sort of everyday basis. It's really hard by the storm. Voice that is really hard by the legacy of public housing and what it takes to maintain it and the level of investment and also the level of neglect. You're not just talking about floodwater, you're not just talking about power and knowledge. We understood better which areas were dangerous areas, why dangerous. Sometimes it's something as simple as not enough lighting. What FAIA stipulates is that the funding can only be resiliency, repairs. What we wanted to do was, our goal was to take every dollar and to for measures that would make it resilient, but would also work the residents. The power of the east side had a deep that signals the presence of bedrock. The materials are very transparent, so they expose the side of it. There's an idea about visibility, understanding. The west side faces Common Park. You can see that it has large scale participate in creating, so the residents can take ownership changes in their. Then it comes to facilities of the distribution of people interested across the site, located between buildings, adjacent to the buildings. All of these facilities will be protected, will be raised, will be provided the elevation that they need today to accommodate the next standing, accommodate sea level rise. The pond added land to the way that they were. They also very differentiated their color. So it's an orienting device, but it's also a way of creating a sense of identity each project.
Text from what the this idea of moving that, just lifting the landscape and creating the zone of protection.
If the neighborhood comes together, water come through, these lily pads will provide staying haven for residents, both central buildings.
We work with this part, making sure that the elevations of the lily pad can you see from your police car to be that's happening. At the same time, we can tell your kid you stay within the 3 minutes of ownership, step on the safe roads.
As people start seeing the changes, they're gonna want more, and see that things can happen. Right?
So this project is still in construction, but they just unveiled the mural a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month and a half ago. And this mural was designed, created with the community, at various age groups, actually, from the youngest to most elderly, and it represents within it a lot of stories that are very specific narratives that are embedded in this mural that have to do with, particular characters, particular members of this community represented in this mural. So I think that it's achieved a lot of what we wanted to, and most importantly, it's also raised awareness of the reason for this project. There's been a lot of understanding of climate change, of why this construction, which is going on for many, many years around the buildings, is happening. And I'll just go to a few details here that perhaps go back to the initial questions of spaces that one can relate to and environments that one can relate to as an individual, and that don't seem to be where the sense of belonging happens, where they are not impervious to you. In other words, you don't come through them and leave them without leaving a mark of some sort, right? So here, like just something as simple as this color that this paint that as you orient yourself around it, it changes in tonality. So it's always kind of addressing you or responding to you as a person moving around the space. So we started late, but I might jump to some other project. How long do we have, Haley? Oh, okay. Okay, so I'll go through this one and next one. Or I will jump through another project so we don't run out of time. Never mind. I'll go through because I think you're controlling in a different way. So this is a project for CUNY. It's the Advanced Science Research Center up Harlem. And it's comprised of 2 buildings that create that space in between them. They are paired under that elevated plaza. So it's really just one center. And here, again, the toggle between the rational, the coherent, and the experience more akin to fascination or discovery happens very clearly in the plan and the partie. These spaces that are depicted in red are the social glue spaces. These are the spaces where you might have haphazard interaction between people in going and coming from their labs or from different departments. And it's really meant to be a place where you're not only going to work and leaving or doing your lab experiment and leaving, but this becomes a place that you identify as your community, your extended community of scientific community in this case. There are material associations that have to do with the history of the site. This used to be a convent, and that was surrounded by a wall of schist stone, Manhattan schist, which no longer can be excavated or used, but this came as a result of the excavation from the subways in New York City. But we created a base to the building that recalled that is, the materiality of that stone is very similar to that of the schist, the tonality of it, and that roots the project before it lifts itself in the glass components. And at the center of both buildings are these social spaces that almost like are these ribbons of interaction that happen where whenever you put a stair next to a lounge, as people come and go, they run into each other, and a sense of community can be then built and expanded on. So these are some of the spaces and models that we're talking about. And again, the introduction of this element of color that is not indifferent to you as a person moving through it, but always kind of references you back because it shifts as you move through it. And these spaces that avoid the linearity and avoid the axial, very coherent view from the beginning of the building to the end of it, but sort of ask you to meander through them. I'm gonna skip through some of these, because again, in the interest of time, and go to something again very different, because this is an adaptive reuse project, and this was very much coming from our client here, which is the Meta offices, and this is at the Farley Post Office. But one of the main mission here was to create spaces where the employees felt at home. This is really the definition of workplace as home, and there are many challenges and many advantages. This project is giant. It's 800 feet by 400. It's like basically 2 city blocks at least. And it's quite a unique building. As you know, this building was restored by SOM, including a portion of it, which is the Moynihan train station, and all the other space was space that we worked on for Meta, for the offices of Meta. It's a landmark building. It's a historic building. And it has a front of house and kind of a workhorse part of the building, which is the mail sorting facility. It was very interesting for us, the narrative of this place as the center or the epicenter of information and communication, and transforming that in a more digital age to the office that would be Meta's office place here. So these, as we started to research the project, we came across these images of the sorting facility and the pneumatic tube, which actually existed, which is incredible to think of as this network that cut through and connected Manhattan. And really as a piece of architecture in the middle part of Manhattan. So you're not looking at a skyline, you're not looking at a streetscape, but you're really entrenched in this working zone, the trunk of other buildings. And the vistas, because of the footprint of the floor plate, are quite large. So you're looking through almost a screen of of windows onto Manhattan around you, Midtown. Some of the givens of the building were these giant atria that brought light into it, but then this other atrium in the center was one that was very important to make that floor plate viable as an office. And there were some elements in the building that were historic elements that we needed to preserve, landmarked. Some very surprising ones, some not so. A lot of texture, a lot of beautiful materiality in some parts of the building. And our mission was really to just, yes, create efficient floor plates for office, etc., but really create a relief from this grid, create areas where people can come together, leave their desks, communicate, socialize, feel at home. And so we started to organize this. Remember that this is almost like city planning within an interior because it's 800 feet by 400 feet, it's giant. But these neighborhoods that ring the perimeter, transitional spaces and social spaces that bring it all together. And one of the first moves was this atrium that would connect to the arrival place, the place of arrival, which is really like where the main lobby is and where you begin your journey up through the building. And the design exercise almost became an exercise in organization and organization of wayfinding and organization of identity of each floor plate. And so what we picked up on were certain elements on each floor that were quite unique. Like the top floor had access to this terrace. The fourth floor had this historic corridor and historic elevator lobbies in it. The third floor had an art wall or potential for an art wall that was very present. The second floor was this connection between the two atria, and then the ground floor was the beginning of the journeys. And so all the materiality, all the selection of materials and patterns and choices that we made, design choices we made, fed right back into this system, I'm going to call it, of thinking, including sectionally, but then in plan, the organization of each part of the plan as it relates to brick patterning that we would apply to different parts of the building. So as we developed this way of thinking through it, when you think about wayfinding, it sounds very banal, but it's actually quite important and can be the source of stress for many people that try to find their way through it, and a source of alienation, actually, whether it's in a city or an interior of a space. You feel a lot more empowered when you know where you're going and where you've been, right? You have a mental image of it. And so each part of the space had a certain character. I'll just talk about this one here. This is one of these historic spaces in the building where we had to maintain the appearance of the surfaces around us of the elevator lobby. We didn't quite know why, but yes, it's historic, but nothing really quite special about it. But we did it. However, we could transform the function of it. So we created these very intimate niches, almost in a library setting, where you could go, you could modify the light fixture a little bit, you could adjust the cushions a little bit, like enough of adjustment of a space that you feel that this is yours and you could be there for however much long you want. These spaces are fully booked all the time, and apparently highly really sought after. But it tells you something, because I think that people want to be there, be within their community, but they also need a space that they can call their own, even if it's for 45 minutes or half an hour of me time. And then the rawness of these materials that we chose, very simple materials, very subtle patterning in the ground. But they have a narrative that's associated with them, but it's a veiled narrative, right? We talked about all the patterning that we found in the buildings or the mailboxes, and these sort of translate through, but not in a way that is very over the top, in a very subtle way. And these are some of the atrium space that connects across. Again, the presence of art, I should say, is not something that there's a group within Meta that curates and selects the art. However, we identify certain spaces that we felt would be interesting to house these. And then just finally, I'll talk about Southworks a little bit. My students are dealing with this site, and they haven't really seen our response to it, so I'll just show it briefly. But it's also an adaptive reuse project, which is quite large. It's an industrial complex that has had been shut up, like closed up, since 2009. And used to be, so these are some of the images of some of the spaces, the interior spaces and spaces in between the buildings. Absolutely beautiful, very interesting spaces. And it has a long history to it that built piecemeal over time with, in 1928, really was housing the Morse chain company, which created, invented, and produced the chain drives, that you help operate gears, etc. And was really instrumental. And they also used to manufacture parts for planes in this place. So we had developed a master plan for the whole site that had to do with mixed use development within that central zone that you see multicolored, but most of it in yellow is affordable and mixed income housing. And the main move that we did was the introduction of this sky chain connection. And what that does, it's a very topographic site. And once you're within that site, you have no access to the views beyond, which down the valley and up to a beautiful lake, Lake Cayuga. So what this chainway does is bring in the public and allow access. It's kind of connective bridge, allow access to these views beyond and access to the site to the general public. So you don't have to own an apartment here. You don't have to rent space here. And you can still have access to the site and to the views beyond. So that was the main move that we made, in addition to the adaptive reuse of different spaces, maker spaces, residences, cultural spaces, retail, food hall, etc., that bring this back to city as a vibrant yet meaningful place, because light manufacturing, there's a big need for that, and there are very few places that we would build now that could accommodate. And so this has been developed as a master plan. It's not happening immediately, but hopefully in the near future, bits and pieces of the site are starting to be developed. Well, first the residential, because there's a huge need for affordable housing in Ithaca. And so that's what's been rolled out first. And then, I want to go back to this question, and I'll share a piece that is an art piece at Art OMI that was commissioned about 2 years ago, still there. And going back to this question of color and interpretation and narrative, and seeing whether it all could start to tie together. This is a piece by Spencer Finch, and it was for the 9/11 memorial, and it's called Trying to Remember the Color of the Sky on That September Morning. So I bring this up because I think it's both very abstract, very universal, and yet very culturally specific and very individual also in the interpretation of that sky. And it generated a series of, prints or exercises in color and thinking about what blue is, what sky is, and what that means. Here, this is a piece that is a multi-sensorial piece in collaboration with this great sound artist, Spencer Topel. And it's made up of 17 reeds that are about 20 to 20 some feet tall, each in a different tonality of blue that match or don't match the color of the sky at certain times of day. So it's always changing. It's always pointing back to the experience of the individual and to the environment that we're in. And it's an interactive piece that if it will play, just a small video, which I will share in a second. But it begs the question of what our environment is and how much of an impact we have on it, and how it, in return, can affect the way that we think about space and fields of space. And this was the activation of the piece by Dual Rivet, the group of dancers, which happened, I think, in over about 2 years ago. Elizabeth was there. And thank you. Yep. So thank you, students, for hanging in until the very last minutes.
I think we have some questions, and while you were presenting, I thought maybe I could ask the first question and then open it up. While you were presenting, I was thinking of this idea of residence and with the different ways we can understand residence in this sort of the diagram that in terms of how we impact the environment and how the environment impacts us. And I was wondering, in the kind of the art of practice itself and the resonances of projects back into the practice, in terms of learning on a long-term basis, how works have impacted the environments and the lives of those who are inhabiting them, and how that may then come back into the practice as learning moments, because it does. That diagram could be read also as a kind of mode of accountability, right? Like as something that could serve as a tool for holding oneself accountable on the long term. And I think that's something that once a project is in the beginning of construction, if not all of them have been completed long enough to be able to do those assessments, but since we are in a kind of NAAB moment, thinking about self-assessment all the time, I wonder, what are the modes of self-assessment as a practice, especially on such a large scale, and how does that shape the conversations we have?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. So for Red Hook Houses, for example, it's a really golden opportunity because all those residents are there before the construction and after the construction happens. And so what we did is right before anything begun, in terms of construction on site, we rolled out a survey and a series of questions, and along with some focus groups that we did before anything happened. course, you always hope for more participation, but we have some. We have like maybe 60. Not enough, but then COVID hit. It was just right before COVID. And the idea was maybe a little bit more, maybe 80. The idea is that you then come back, we come back once everything is in place, the project's finished, we wait a few months until people settle into it, and we ask those same questions again. And we do that whole same focus group again, because it's an ideal scenario because you have the same people when you change the environment, right? And so the questions have to do with issues that they faced in their surroundings prior to our intervention and after the intervention, right? After the project is complete. Concerns that they had, specifics about particular places that we came to understand, or particular issues in the environment that we came to understand through our workshops with them. So that's a great opportunity that we have, and I hope that we can, learn from it. And then another one, which is in the process of happening, COVID again put like a big stop on a lot of these post-occupancy evaluations, I guess we call them, was for the Advanced Science Research Center. And that's a great audience or group to do this with, because they are scientists and they are researchers and they understand the value of evaluation in that way. And so we also have a series of a post-occupancy evaluation survey that we had hoped to roll out, but then COVID happened. So we said, okay, let's wait and make sure everybody comes back. Now they're fully back. And so but I think that's a very important question to hold ourselves accountable to, and to also learn from what we as designers and architects assume is the right solution and is going to produce a certain result, but to actually try to understand whether it does or not. And maybe it produces a result you didn't intend, but is also useful to understand. Phil.
It was really great, especially seeing the adjacency projects that selected. I was most struck by the notion of the cultural result, and in specifically thinking about the project that counts.
Hong Kong University of Science and Technology.
I think there's a very simplistic reading of firms like KPF to see them as ultimately very universal, working in all these different cultures and kind of exporting a Western aesthetic to those cultures. And in your description, specifically, I was struck by the bamboo discussion, and mentioning symbolicism of cultural elements, or maybe to use a different phrase, the particularity of element that might ground the project in a place. So I'm curious. I can see a situation where a client overseas might be really interested in the kind of aesthetic service that a firm like KPF provides, to give them a level of kind of maturity or brand, right? At the same time, you're seeking this kind of cultural brand. And I can see that in the way, especially on my ground, building a beautiful first of all, I'm curious, how do you guys, in your work, have you been able to assess that kind of range between it becomes so abstract that it becomes kind of meaningless, but at the same time feels grounded in a place? And does that dialogue engage the builders in the area itself? Just kind of curious, like how you deal with that.
So if I understand correctly, I think you're asking, is that narrative too abstract in a way?
Well, I think on every project it's going to be different. It's going to sometimes be more successful than an idea or whatever. I guess I'm curious, like, how did you go about that engagement with that idea with the client? You try to engage the local building culture to kind of arrive at that, which seems like that would be a very easy way to avoid the universal and get to the particular by virtue of it becoming grounded in literally the kind of capabilities of the workers in place. And that seemed like one where you were originating really nicely this sophistication of what KPF offers, but at the same time, this kind of very nice idea and become this kind of texture and color.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious, like how you assess that, maybe as an organization, not as an organization, but specifically KPF, because you're so strong, you're such an incredibly strong partner. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because, you know, in the first project, the facade covers, so they actually would use a form liner that initially was molded from the bamboo. It was manufactured there, it was built there. And so it was initially would be molded from these bamboo shoots, I guess, halves. And then sort of smoothed out and cast, etc. So it doesn't quite relate to, in an ideal scenario, I agree with you, it would relate very directly to local vernacular building techniques in some way, shape, or form. I think here it was a little bit more removed from that. It acknowledged it and nodded to it, but it was a little bit more removed from that actual making culture or skill, right? Vernacular skill, vernacular architecture. I think it's a really interesting question. I can see how that can happen in smaller projects, projects that don't rely, medium to small scale projects, let's say, where you could be working more hand in hand with local construction groups and learn from them, and it's kind of a back and forth in that sense. In this case, this was a really unusual project for us in that we were not there during the process of construction. It was during COVID, literally. And so there are many translations and like steps of removal in the making of the buildings.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is actually unusual for us because we're like global but local. We set up offices, we have people in the places that we're building in that allow us to have more of that back and forth dialogue.
It's a local.
Work local search. Work local. I do use that term, so.
I have one question about the reading of, if I remember correctly, the diagram. There was a dichotomy between the cultural and you didn't call it universal, but something about that. And then you read the quote from Kassem, and I think you related the surface to the cultural. The other term that he used, or the one that resonates
Deeply. Mm-hmm.
So this question of surface with local, and there was some projects that at least the reference that you were using, even perhaps the bamboo project, the one that the part of my question is about a part of architecture that deals with the cultural, is the part of the architecture or the aspect of architecture that deals with the universal. Let's see, both in that BD and in some of the projects that you showed, the role of the surface deals with the local or the one that generates a sense of belonging, the ones that feels or the part of the architecture that feels in depth. Generally handles the question of universal. And that, or for example, there are the moments that the depth in architecture deals with the culture.
Yes.
Typology. And I saw it in your work, but because you didn't put it that way, I was just curious what you think about that. Like some of those, the beautiful, the Redwood project, there was something brilliant about placing that, power plant. It wasn't the difference, but in fact, the combination of power plant and raising what you call any path, central courtyard, seem to be problem. They would create some definition of the differences, in the role of courtyard versus. It seemed they create something that potentially can create different sense of belonging to different courtyard.
Yeah.
But it seems that suddenly, again, the color became the kind of qualifier for there's something that deals with the surface became about that.
Yeah.
And I was curious when I walked in, those moments that you think that depth is doing, bringing the notion of belonging or the color specific.
Yeah, I think that's a really at the heart of the matter question, really at the crux of it. And I feel that in many ways, the beginning of going into that mode of maybe fascination that then goes into the more abstract and takes you into the universal. But the way of entering at that portal can be a superficial portal in a way, like it could be connotation. You associate some aspect of the surface or a symbol with a word, right? A word that has meaning, and that is a very cognitive function. Like my interpretation of it, it has a particular meaning that has to do with my upbringing, my background, my language. And it's my way of, or anybody's way of entering into this, entering into that realm. Once you get past that threshold, then you can go into the more abstract and more universal aspect of things that start to connect us. So the reason why I brought that example of music, I feel like in music, and that example of, say classical music versus music with some lyrics to it, more popular music. I think you can see there how that can happen. Somebody that might say, oh, I'm not trained in classical music. I don't really know anything about it. I'm not going to listen to this. It's not something that appeals to me. But then the words, the lyrics in the more popular music attracts them, right? That is their mechanism of entering into that realm of music. And then from there, it can go into the more universal, because there are certain sounds that we all relate to, minor tones, major tones. We all relate to those in a very similar way, where you get behind just in time when you can get behind the lyrics. So I think that's a really useful way, at least when I'm thinking about this question, which you bring up is a really significant question to me and in my work. And I don't have the solution and the answer, but that's always a very good analogy to try to see how one can bring you into the other.
Yeah. I'm ask an easier one. I guess you've been a KPF almost 20 years.
20 some years, yes.
20. Okay. Didn't want to overguess. It didn't be a long time. And so apart from the kind of effects of you gaining seniority and their work and instruction.
This is meant to be an easy question.
I don't know, like, how has the office changed? How has the profession changed? How have your clients changed? And how have your tasks changed? I mean, do you see kind of general trends that you either find liberative or really annoying? Just you've seen the culture transform in one place over a generation.
Yeah. So actually, you're right. It's an easy question. So this question, this issue or this notion of our effects on environments and the effects of environments on us. So our effects on environments, you could say, okay, well, this is sustainability, right? Question of sustainability. And 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, it was really difficult to bring sustainability into projects. It was, we had all the intentions and we would try. And some clients and some markets were more open to it than others. Now we're at a point where it's really part of code in many ways, right? It's enforced from authorities, top down. There's the 2030 challenge in New York City. There's a lot more scaffolding and structure that allows us to just think about sustainability as a matter of fact. Embedded in the project, nobody questions it. Most of our clients are asking for projects that have certain lead rating. So our task is much easier and it's just become part of the culture. It's just embedded in on both sides, design side and the client side. The other part, impact of environments on us, say has to do with wellness, right? And there's a rising awareness, especially through COVID and after the COVID years, of people really wanting to understand the impacts of environments on their health. Sick building syndromes, but also the fact that we left the office or we left our work environments and we went home and we're very aware of how a space impacts us. It's been heightened, been brought to a point of beyond something that's nice to have. Good design can now be thought of as, a matter of equity, right? Because it can affect your health. And so once you start thinking about it that way, you're entitled to good design because you're entitled to good health. Like you're entitled to spaces that don't make you sick and that make you at least better, somehow better. And so that trend, I think, is catching up to the sustainability one. So sustainability and wellness become one thing, and that part, which has to do not only with physical well-being, but I mentioned a little bit these conversations and these studies that have to do with neuroscience and architecture, and so really starting to unpack and understand the effect of elements in the environment on people from a cognitive point of view, from a not only physical point of view, but emotional, cognitive, social point of view. It's really fascinating. And when you think about it, I would imagine most architects should be very interested in this because this is what we do. This is the kind of privilege that we have as makers of space. It comes with a certain responsibility.
I'm going to add changes in culture. Yeah, recent years.
Yeah, so I do think that those two questions, and especially the attention to the people that we design for, it's become much more front and center. It's less about architecture for architecture's sake, and it's more about what can architecture do for cities and for people that use it or inhabit it.
I guess I had a question, but you're trying to incorporate sort of elements of culture into, the communist states, really, trying to bring that sort of sense of belonging to an individual, but doing that, in specific sort of building elements. You sort of worried about maybe this ability of essentializing like culture into like very sort of specific things that sort of reinforces, the reductive notion of like the culture and sort of inhabits people's sense of their culture in sort of reinforces that sort of sense of culture in the sort of shaping of space.
Yes, I worry about that all the time. I worry about it all the time, and I think it's not an easy line to, toggle. And this is why when we do touch on the narrative, it's never closed, complete thing. Always an open work. It's always open for interpretation, and it always sits at a place where it's between being very abstract and being something that you can relate to a memory, a material, like a moment in spaces that you've known that are culturally specific to you or individual, like individual memories. So I think it's a very difficult thing to do. And again, I don't presume that I don't have the assumption that we've achieved it in many ways. I think we are attempting or getting close to certain aspects that of spaces that are open enough that they allow you to, enter and interpret them in a way that you can make them own. But it's really trying to, like, the difficulty is in trying to create this door that you can open, you can interact with the space, and it relates back to you as an individual. So it's never a closed, complete thing. And it modifies itself as you move around it and as you use it. So, like in Red Hook, even the color is always shifting, and those 14 electric distribution pods are shielded with an expanded aluminum mesh. And that expanded aluminum mesh screens that color. So even as you're moving through around the buildings and around the campus, the whole development, it relates back to you. Like the color's there, then it's not there. But it relates to you and your position, and quite literally your position in that whole space.
And I think we have to wrap up, but I think just one quick question before we do, so just in closing, and it's just because it's really great to have visiting faculty join us. I think that the whole point of having outside professors in the fourth year is to bring a kind of completely different perspective and culture and join our community for a short time. So it seems like you bring huge wealth of experience and expertise to the fourth year studio. I'd just love to hear, what are you experiencing? Is there a level of surprise, frustration? I think you just tell us a little bit
Two of them still standing. 3 of them.
Just love to hear some feedback from your side about engaging in the community work and the studio environment. Is the project that you showed us that you have in the students engage in, what is a little bit of some feedback response you see here in terms of this.
No, I've been actually not surprised, but it's I'm happy to see that the culture of making and experimenting and without preconceived notions of what an architecture ought to be is still here. And that's great to see. I think the students are asking the right questions at the right time, and they're fearless in a way, which is great. And they're fearless in the sense that, like, it's quite a demanding studio. I think it's a urban design studio. It's a large site. We're dealing with adaptive reuse. We're dealing with concepts that are difficult to grasp if you haven't really experienced them firsthand, which is, the concept or the challenge of displaced populations. This is a challenge that's not going away because populations are being displaced for many reasons, some climate change, some violence, some political unrest in various parts of the world. So we're seeing this is very much of this time now, and we're living it. So trying to understand we're trying to tackle these questions simultaneously and trying to grasp and grapple with the scale of the site. I mean, it's a challenging studio, and I feel like the students are really taking it on, each individually in their own way, finding their portal into it. It's great.
One more short. So thank you for your talk. My question comes from 24 hours, 2 years ago when I knew you only as an artist.
No.
For 24 hours. We were seeing your piece at Oh My and not knowing about your work as an architect. So in this notion, and I found your talk super interesting when I tried to imagine your imaging of your own self as an artist versus an architect, not versus, but like, what is the environment of working as an artist and you're in the environment you are in working as an architect? Those two super different environments affect you as the person working in those two, because it's remarkably different.
Yeah, it is. And so that maybe goes back to one of the first things that I mentioned, in that the audience that is experiencing a piece like an art installation is more like the audience that is going to a sacred space, or the audience that is going to this like the Nora Observatory. It's an audience that is already primed to have an experience, and they're awaiting it and they're receptive to it. And so they are looking for, okay, how is this environment going to affect me, and how am I going to feel? And they're like hypersensitized to it. Versus the audience that we design for, academic buildings or office buildings, or create a master plan for, which is an audience that's just trying to go about their day. It's their day-to-day practice of everyday life. And so it's an interesting question, because how does that change how you design or how you shape environments? I think it does, but I think the idea is that, like here, it's a rarefied air, right? It's very distilled. People are already expecting it, and you can do something that just gets to the point right then. It's more distilled. Whereas in the realm of architecture, at the scale of buildings types of buildings that we do, they're not sacred spaces, right? That is a type of architecture, but we're not engaged in that kind of typology yet. So it's a little bit more challenging. And I'm not saying that like the goal is to have people walk into a space and be in awe and all the time, but I think it would be great if those spaces elevate their day-to-day experience, and that they can have moments where they feel connected to these spaces and sort of enriched by those spaces, that they're everyday spaces. And so that's the difference, and that's the kind of translation that I think would be great to be able to, make happen.
Thank you.